It's time for Who's Who Tonight. Interesting topics, fascinating people. And now, your host of Who's Who Tonight, Mark Bishop.
His name is David Richard Berkowitz. It is considered to be one of the most infamous serial killers of the 20th century. Starting in the summer of 1976, he began a series of shootings that terrorized the people of New York City. The paranoia that ensued gained worldwide media coverage. The press named him the .44 caliber killer, but he was better known by the self-proclaimed name Son of Sam. Berkowitz managed over the course of a year to amass a total of 13 victims, 6 dead and 7 wounded. He was captured by the NYPD in August of 1977. In June of 1978, Berkowitz was sentenced to 6 consecutive 25-year-to-life sentences for each murder committed, and is currently serving his time at Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. Tonight's guest grew up with Berkowitz. They were raised in the same neighborhood, attended the same high school, and became close friends, in which Berkowitz once considered our guest as his best friend. The two went on to serve in the same auxiliary police corps unit with the New York City Police Department. Our guest went on to serve with the United States Coast Guard, and in 1975 became a police officer with the city of Baltimore, Maryland. Will you please welcome tonight's guest, Mr. Ed Snediker. Ed, welcome to Who's Who Tonight.
Hey, Mark. Nice to see you again.
You too, Ed. Ed, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Well, let's see. I was born and raised in New York and left there when I was 18. I entered into the service, the U.S. Coast Guard. Did 4 years active there and then went on to be a Baltimore City police officer.
And what was the name of the high school you attended?
Christopher Columbus.
And David Berkowitz was a classmate?
Berkowitz and I, we went to school together.
Now, the two of you grew up in the section of New York called the Bronx, correct?
Bronx, New York.
Was there a particular section?
I grew up in the Fordham section, but after my parents died, I moved in with my sister. Okay. And she lived in Co-op City.
Do you remember the first time you met David Berkowitz?
You know, growing up in New York, you run into so many people. In this area called Co-op City, it was a group of, I believe there were 30 buildings. And the smallest one was 24 stories tall. They had a 24, a 32, and I believe it was a 36-story tall building. And the kids, you know, that you ran into, they were just so numerous.
Right.
Each building might have, 600 kids, and you just run into different people. I really don't recall how I ran into Berkowitz.
Gotcha. But the area was called Co-op City?
Co-op City. Yeah, it was a group of cooperatives. And that was before condos became the thing. In New York, it was a blue-collar area. A lot of police officers, firefighters, mailmen. Just working-type people lived in these co-ops where you paid so much to purchase the unit, and you then also paid like a rental fee on top of that.
Gotcha.
And there was a lot of blue-collar families that moved into that section. It used to be, I don't know if you ever heard of a place called Freedom Land. Freedom Land was a big amusement park that went up in New York, and it was based upon the old U.S. They had a Chicago fire in old New York and things like that. But in 63, the New York World's Fair came in.
Right.
And put Freedom Land under.
Oh, well.
So they tore it down and built this apartment complex.
So they tore down the amusement park and they built this co-op in its place.
Absolutely.
It was called Co-op City.
Co-op City.
Okay. Do you remember the year you moved in?
I'm thinking it had to be somewhere about 67 or so, because my father died in 65. My mom, I believe, died in 67. So right about then.
David Berkowitz probably moved in at the same time, or was already there at the time when you had moved in?
He was already there when I moved in.
Gotcha, okay. Now, is it possible that the two of you first met in school rather than the neighborhood?
Very possible. Yeah, there were two schools that the kids from Co-op City went at that time, if you were in high school. One was at Vanda Childs High School, and the other one was Christopher Columbus. Both these schools had a school population of probably 4,000 to 5,000 kids.
Gotcha.
So, they was pretty much split between the two different schools.
So I guess you and Berkowitz were probably in your mid-teens when you became friends?
Yeah, about 15, 16 years old.
So did you guys ever hang out at his house?
We never hung in the houses. For the most part, we were out doing things. There was a lot of activities to do in the community. That was the one thing nice about living in Co-op City.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was community organizations. They had a teen club and they had a youth group. And, so we would spend most of the time outside rather than in each other's houses.
Right. So I guess at the time, were you aware of his home life at all, of his situation with his parents, his relationship with his parents?
Yeah, I was, because, of course, I would go over to his apartment, knock on the door. His father, Nat, would answer the door. "Hi, Ed, how you doing? Come on in." And Nat was a very nice man. He owned a hardware store in the South Bronx and had worked there or owned it for 30-some-odd years.
Mm-hmm.
And he would invite me in. I knew Nat was a widower. So, Dave and his father, actually, it turned out his adopted father.
Right.
Lived in Co-op City, and Dave was being raised as an only child.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, did Berkowitz ever talk about his home life? Did he ever confide in you about the personal things that happened at home with him?
I guess you would say he was concerned because he never felt a lot of affection from Nat. Nat was a businessman. Nat got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, went to his hardware store in the South Bronx 6 days a week. Came home 10 o'clock at night, same thing the next day. Up at 6, off to work, and back. So Dave did not get a lot of attention from Nat Berkowitz.
I think I remember you telling me that Dave's father used to take you to school every day.
Actually, Nat in the mornings would be leaving about the same time Dave and I would be going to school. So rather than us having to take New York City transit, since in New York City, if you going into high school, you didn't travel on a school bus. You had to get there through using public transportation. So you would get a bus pass to use on public transit. But Nat would be going by the school anyway, so he would drop us off at the school in the morning.
And there is a gentleman by the name of Daniel Lefkowitz who says he was from the neighborhood and knew you and Dave Berkowitz. He did a video interview with Berkowitz in 2009 at the prison that he's currently serving time. They discussed the auxiliary police unit that Berkowitz was once involved in. Were you in that unit?
I was. It was one of those things where when you lived in the Bronx, you tried as a 17-year-old young man, there was two ways to go. You either became a good guy or a bad guy. And my friends, most of them, thank God I hung out with guys who were decent folks. And at 17, you could join the New York City Auxiliary Police. But at 17, you couldn't be a regular officer with the Auxiliary Police, but you could work on the rescue squad. So we worked on the 45th Precinct's rescue squad. And one night a week, we go out patrolling. And besides regular patrol, we respond to car accidents, any type of emergencies, power outages, supplying generators at hospitals.
So like an emergency response.
Yeah, we were a rescue truck. It was a fully equipped rescue truck, just like any fire department or police department rescue.
Gotcha.
Stokes baskets, first aid kits, generators, all the tools that we used during in that day. Of course, they developed some newer ones, but for extricating people from vehicles and if they were trapped. And we'd go out and patrol and respond to any type of emergencies that we might be sent to.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, in this interview, the two of them seem to mention you. Lefkowitz states, "Your best friend was Ed," to which Berkowitz states, "Yeah, I had a friend, Ed. Yeah, he was a great guy. Yeah, his father was a New York City fireman. Yeah, so..." Lefkowitz then asks, "Do you still hear from him?" Berkowitz answers, No, after I came to prison, I lost contact with all the friends I had." So I would assume they're talking about you.
I would assume so. Yeah, I don't know any other Ed that he associated with at all.
So your dad was a New York City firefighter?
Yeah, he was. He was a New York City firefighter for 13 years and was killed in 1965 at a fire.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That was one of his ambitions because you guys were in a police unit that he wanted to be a cop?
Dave always sort of mentioned that he wanted to become a firefighter, actually. That's where he was leaning, I thought.
You know, there has been a lot of speculation that he was an arsonist and set a lot of fires in the area. What's your opinion on that?
No, I don't believe he was actually involved with that. Actually, one of the people who sort of pointed fingers at not only Dave, but me also, was a security officer that worked at Co-op City. And I had fire marshals come by my house to interview me. And it turned out that it was a security officer that pointed them in our direction. And it turns out the security officer was arrested with police badges, fire badges, equipment they stole from firehouses while the fire department was out on calls.
Uh-huh.
And he actually was, I'm not sure if he was ever found guilty. I know he was eventually charged with committing some of the arsons.
Well, that's interesting. As you know, most of his victims were women. Did you see any animosity toward women? Did he have a mean streak toward girls that you can remember at all?
Dave was always sort of the guy who would help people. Not only with like the rescue unit with the 45th precinct, but if there was an older woman coming with groceries, he'd go over and ask, "Can I help you with those?" He'd hold doors open for people. He was always a decent guy as far as I could see. Yeah, I only like nice people, so I wasn't going to hang out with somebody who was a bad guy. And he always was a gentleman and always treated friends of ours very nicely. I never saw him do anything bad to anybody.
So there was no indication at the time, anything in his character that would make you think that...
No, he didn't torture dogs and kittens and or, do anything that anybody and any other teenager didn't do. I mean, I'm not going to say he didn't throw a snowball at somebody. He did what teenagers did, but he was never hurtful or mean or nasty towards people.
But nothing at the magnitude that eventually he became infamous for.
No, not at all.
Did you guys graduate high school together?
Actually, I did not graduate. Dave went on. He graduated in June of 71. After my father died, my mother got very ill. I wound up having to drop out of school for a couple of years to take care of her, and then she passed on.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried going back to school, but I was like 2 years behind everybody else, so I was the big dummy in the class, I was like 2 years older than everybody.
Right.
So I wound up dropping out and later on going and getting my GED and then went on to college after going in service.
Did you guys enter the military around the same time?
I entered in May of 71 and Dave, after graduation in June, entered the Army.
Now, was that something that you guys had discussed beforehand or?
Not really, no. Dave, I believe, needed to not needed to get away, but it was something, like I said earlier, Mark, he wasn't feeling the love at home is basically what it was. And I think he wanted to go out and experience life. And, as far as I was concerned, being an orphan, already and living with my sister, I didn't feel very comfortable. I knew I had to get out on my own. So, we both decided we were going to enlist, but we really didn't discuss that at all. As a matter of fact, when I enlisted, I came back and told my buddies I enlisted. They just looked at me because I hadn't even mentioned anything to them at that point.
Now, in your time in the military, you were a member of the United States Coast Guard, and also thank you for your service to our country. And you said that Dave Berkowitz had entered the United States Army. Mm-hmm. Did your careers pretty much coincide with each other as far as length of time, length of duty?
No, his enlistment was for 3 years of active duty, and mine was for 4. So he got out a year ahead of me out of the military commitment.
Okay, so now at the time when you guys were in the military together, he was in the Army, you were in the Coast Guard. Did you guys ever get together?
We saw each other once in a while if we just happened to be on leave at the same time. And we did keep in touch when he went overseas using the mails.
Okay, so you guys pretty much just wrote letters back and forth.
Yeah, of course, there was no email back in those days. You know, the U.S. Postal Service was the only way you were going to communicate with people.
Right. So while you were in the Coast Guard, did you ever make it back to New York?
I had planned on it, but New York City Police and Fire Department were not hiring whatsoever. At that time, New York City was going through major financial problems. So I was in Baltimore, and I knew that they were hiring police officers. I went up and took the exam to be a police officer in Baltimore.
So you came to Baltimore for the sole purpose of getting hired with the police department?
Well, I was stationed here in Baltimore my last year and a half.
Oh, so you were at Curtis Bay. A very famous broadcaster was stationed there at one time.
Arthur Godfrey.
Arthur Godfrey.
WFBR. Started as an engineer.
And let's go back to talking about this video on YouTube between Daniel Lefkowitz and Berkowitz. Lefkowitz says to Berkowitz, you know, it's interesting because I distinctly remember I had spoken to Ed, and you were in Korea at the time. Berkowitz takes a drink of water and says, yeah, Korea. Lefkowitz goes on to say, and I distinctly remember him telling me that because I asked him about you, and he said you were having some problems in Korea or the Army. Berkowitz goes on about some emotional struggles and possible depression, but doesn't really seem to know what you were referring to. Can you elaborate on that, Ed?
Well, I recall there was a period of time when me and there were basically five of us that hung out together, but Berkowitz being one of the guys. And, you know, but there was four other guys that hung out together, me and John Comparetto and Lenny Dapolito and Jeff Hardenberg. And we were all getting letters from Berkowitz from Korea. And at the time, the letters were sending some very mixed signals, shall we say. You know, like I might get a letter saying, and he might have went into the more military type stuff with me, since I could relate to an Article 15, which was non-judicial punishment that would happen in a military situation where somebody might get extra duty or they'd have to do KP or something like that for extra hours. And I might get a letter telling me that he had extra duty to do. And other guys would, Lenny Dapolito or John or somebody, might get a letter just saying how certain things just weren't working well for him over in Korea. And we got the idea that he might have been into some drugs at the time.
Yeah, it seems like the military was a turning point in his life because it seems like when he came out of the military, his personality had changed.
Well, obviously, because as I said, you know, as kids growing up, he was a nice guy. You know, we played sports together. We played all the typical things in New York, stickball and football and baseball. And he would go and help the old lady carrying packages. And, you know, he was always holding doors open for people and trying to do the right things. And then when he came back, he obviously started doing some bad things that just were out of character for the Dave I knew at the time.
Now, would you attribute that to anything? Was it something going on in his personal life that caused him to, maybe it was a combination of things of being away from home, in the military, maybe his treatment in the military, amongst other things?
Well, I know when he got home, he was pretty upset because he got home and Nat had told him that, well, Nat Berkowitz being his dad, told him he was remarried and Nat was ready to move on with his life at that time. I believe he told Dave he was moving to Florida. And there's a young lady, and I'll just call her Iris. I won't use the last name because we are still very good friends, who he basically had a relationship with before he left to go to Korea. And when he came home, she had married and moved to Milwaukee at that time. And actually, in Milwaukee, she got married. I believe it was Milwaukee or Indianapolis. And she got married to a guy who became a police officer out there.
Oh. Mm.
So therefore, you know, and Iris had very long dark hair. And Mark, if you remember,
Yes,
Berkowitz went around shooting girls with long dark hair.
prior to the relationship with her, had he had other, like, steady girlfriends?
Not that I recall. Yeah, when you say steady girlfriend, when you're 15, 16, 17 years old, steady is a week and a half, 10 days.
Right.
You know, that's a long-term commitment back then. But Iris was that special person in his life when he left to go overseas.
Now, was she from the neighborhood?
She lives in Co-op City also.
Okay, and did she go to high school with you also?
She went to Evander Childs. As I said, there was two high schools. You had Columbus and you had Evander.
Got you. And approximately what age were they at the time? Teenagers?
Yeah, 16 and a half, 17 when they started dating and going out. And
I see.
You know, when I say going out, yeah, we at the movie once in a while, Friday night, you go to the movie, hanging out, holding hands, you know, maybe some kissing in the stairwell.
Right. But there was a significant, at least in Berkowitz's mind, there was a significant relationship with Iris.
Oh, yeah. For a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, yeah, it was pretty significant. But then again, when you're 17, 18-year-old, every relationship you have is a significant relationship if you're with somebody for over 2 or 3 weeks.
Now, they were dating prior to his entrance into the military, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, for probably maybe a year, 8 months, 9 months before.
Right.
Is when they started dating. And I remember Iris crying when she found out he was leaving to go into the Army. And, you know, of course, Vietnam was going on at the time, too. And nobody knew didn't matter what branch you were in, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, where they were going to send you. You know, it could have been Vietnam. So, you know, I'm sure that was a factor in, you know, her emotions at the time.
Mm. So, at what period from the time he had left for the military and he had left Iris, did he discover the fact that Iris was technically no longer in his life?
When did he realize it? I think it was when he got home. After his father had said to him, you know, well, I'm moving, you know, I got remarried and I'm moving away. I believe Dave went over to Iris's house. It might have been that afternoon, the same day or whatever, and knocked on the door, and this Iris's mother answered the door and said, "Oh, Dave, how you doing? Nice to see you. Glad you're home." Oh, Iris, no, she doesn't live here anymore. She moved away to Milwaukee.
Ooh.
So he found, you know, he had a double banger. And when he also got home, he didn't have any friends. Because you have to remember, the guys who we hung out with, myself and John Comparetto, Jeff Hardenberg, those three that I just mentioned, myself and Jeff and John, well, they're police officers also. And of course, I went into law enforcement. Lenny didn't go into law enforcement, but we all pulled away from Berkowitz because of the letters that we were getting from him. We just didn't want to be close to him at that point.
I see.
So we backed away. So he comes back to New York. He loses his father. When I say loses, you know, dad's leaving to go to Florida.
Correct.
His girlfriend is now gone and in Milwaukee or Indianapolis. And the guys he hung out with, where are we? Well, I'm in Baltimore anyway, living down here. And the other guys who were still in the New York area had backed away from wanting to associate with him.
So you saw something in his character that sent up a red flag?
Through the letters, basically. You know, if I had been in New York, I don't know what would have happened if I had a contact with him as soon as he got home. You know, we could always, you know, just sort of think about, you know, how, if I had been in New York, how that might have changed things. Maybe, you know, having somebody that was in the military also and could maybe bring him to the right side, no matter what problems he ran into. But I was 300 miles away, living in Baltimore, so I didn't have a daily contact with them.
Right.
And John and Lenny and Jeff, they really didn't continue a close relationship with them at that point.
So all this kind of went down as soon as he came home from the military, correct?
Oh, yeah, this was, it would have been 1974.
1974?
1974, because he enlisted in 71 with 3 years of active duty. He would have got out in, I guess it would have been June or July of 74.
So prior to him coming home from the military, he had no idea that the relationship between he and Iris were over?
Well, he realized he wasn't getting any more letters from her, probably about 4 or 5, 6 months prior to him returning to the States, but didn't understand why. I guess, well, actually, I remember him saying to me that maybe she was just busy with school thinking that she had gone on to college, and that's why he thought maybe she wasn't writing as much as she did.
I don't know. I mean, maybe the assumption is that he was just trying to be positive about the whole situation, not really realizing that the relationship was over.
Yeah, well, very true. And I wasn't around to know what was going on up in New York.
But all of this happened as soon as he came out of the Army, correct?
He might have had a week or two to go. He might, going through the discharge process at Fort Dix or something.
Gotcha.
But he was on his way out.
Okay, so he comes home from Korea, finds out that his father has remarried and is leaving town. His girlfriend had married someone and left town, and all his friends are gone.
Yeah, we're definitely not close to him anymore.
Okay, so now I think we can all see this downward spiral. Now, one can come to the conclusion that most of his victims were dark-haired women, that in essence he was taking his revenge out on these women because they resembled Iris.
Yeah, I would say that. When he came home and found that Iris had basically moved on with her life while he was away, I think he was trying to take some vengeance out on women with dark hair. And there came a time in New York when, that came up in by the police that, all the victims had dark hair, and so girls were running out to the beauty parlors. It gave the beauty parlors a good shot in the arm because women were running out getting their hair dyed blonde.
Right.
Because they didn't want to be that dark-headed girl walking down the street singing in a car or just sing on a porch.
So you were, at the time when he was discharged, you were still in the Coast Guard, and you were stationed at Curtis Bay, Maryland, which is right outside of Baltimore. Actually, it's
in Baltimore.
It is in Baltimore, yeah. You were discharged from the Coast Guard at what year?
1975. May 75.
Okay. Now, from there, you went on to join the Baltimore Police Department, correct?
Yeah, there was a short period where I actually worked for the federal government as a police officer with the Federal Protective Service. But that was several months until Baltimore City called me. In November of 1975 is when I started with Baltimore City Police.
November of 75, you became a Baltimore City police officer.
I was sworn in, yes.
All right, Ed. Tell us the story about when you revisited your old neighborhood and you ran into Berkowitz on the street.
Yeah, he was driving a cab, and he was working for the post office, I know, at the time. And he was also driving a cab part-time to make some extra money. And he was parked on I believe it was Dreisler Loop was the name of the street. And it was right next to a shopping center in Co-op City. And I happened to see him sitting there in the cab. And I'm not sure if I saw him or he saw me, but, we both saw each other. And we got into a conversation.
It had been a while since you've seen each other.
Oh, it had been probably 2 years at least since the last time I saw him actually would have been before he left to go to Korea.
Oh, I see.
So that had to be somewhere in maybe early 72. So we're talking about 3 years since the last time I had actually had contact with him, except through mail.
Now, at this time, you had already been hired on with the police department in Baltimore, correct?
Yeah, I was just working the streets in the Southern District in Baltimore City at the time.
Okay, so that would have been early to mid-1976, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that was probably early 76.
Okay. Now, that's around the time where he started committing some of these murders, correct?
The timeline would indicate that he had already, committed maybe a murder or 2 or 3 at that time. Of course, he did not know I was a police officer when we were standing there talking in the Bronx.
Now, did he spot you first, or did you spot him first?
Mark, 40 years ago, I don't recall.
Right.
He might have been standing outside the cab. I looked over and happened to see him standing outside the cab, or I might have been walking by, and He might have been sitting in the cab because he was familiar with that area, so I'm sure he was probably cruising the area looking for passengers. And our eyes just met again, I guess. And yeah, one of us said, "Hey, how you doing?"
So, Ed, do you recall the conversation? Do you remember what you guys said to each other? Or
Well, Dave was telling me he wasn't happy any longer in New York. He said that he really didn't have much of a life at home because he lived in an apartment in Yonkers, New York, and he had no friends to speak of. All he did was work and come home, and he didn't have any type of a social life. And he felt as if he really wasn't growing in life at that point. Well, we got talking about different things, and I had said to him, you know, Dave, you might want to put New York behind you. I said, and move on with life. And, you know, why don't you come down to Maryland and take a look around? You might like it down there. So here I was inviting him down into my world and saying, Dave, why don't you come down and take a look? You might like Baltimore. Baltimore's a nice town and good people, and it's smaller than New York, a little slower pace.
right?
But, you know, it had opportunities back then, too.
At what point of the conversation did things kind of go sour?
Well, all I remember is him saying, yeah, you know what, Baltimore doesn't sound like a bad idea. He says, yeah, I might think about going down there and taking a look around. He says, what are you doing with your life down there? I said, I'm a cop. Well, there was a strange look on the man's face at that time, and he said, you're a cop? And I went, yeah. And at that point, I remember him saying he had a fare to go pick up and that he'd be in touch with me. And he jumps in the cab and it drives away. And that was the last contact I had with him until I happened to hear that he was arrested for homicide.
Yeah, so the minute he found out you were a cop, it was like...
Yeah, as soon as he found out I was a police officer in Baltimore, yeah, it sort of ended really fast.
Did that send up any signals to you?
No, you know, I was thinking more along the lines that since he may have run into some of these problems, like I said, in the service, and he might have had some interaction with military police, that he wasn't very comfortable with police any longer. And
Gotcha. So at one time, he was in auxiliary police with you in the 45th Precinct, and now things had changed.
Things had changed. And since we didn't have an in-depth conversation about what was going on and how much his life had changed.
Right.
You know, I thought maybe, yeah, that being a police officer may have spooked him. But, of course, I would never have thought that the reason for his sudden departure was due to the fact that he was a mass murderer.
All right, Ed, tell us about the moment you discovered that your friend David Berkowitz was the son of Sam.
Telephone conversation I got from one of my friends, the guy who I mentioned earlier in an interview, John Comparetto, who's a New York City officer at the time, advising me that they had caught the son of Sam. And I remember saying to John, I got to get up for work in the morning. I'll give you a call tomorrow afternoon after I get off work, and we can discuss it, because I was in bed, actually, and getting ready to go to sleep when John called to let me know that they had captured the son of Sam. I hung up the phone in the kitchen.
So to you just thought it was just him kind of bragging. Yeah, we got the SOB, so to speak.
Exactly, because, you know, at that time, the son of Sam was national news. It was all over every paper.
I remember it. Every day there was something mentioned about it. And, and I know for a while he was actually taunting the police by corresponding with
Jimmy Brenslin, who was a reporter for the New York Daily News.
Yes.
Sending them letters.
Yes. So this friend of yours, who's a New York NYPD, calls you.
Yeah, and so I hung up the phone after, you know, that brief conversation. I start walking back into the bedroom, and my wife was in bed, and she says, "Who's that?" I said, "Well, it's John Comparetto letting me know they caught the son of Sam." And just about the time I said that, which was probably 15, 20 seconds since I hung up the telephone, it rings again, and it's John Comparetto. And he starts out with an expletive and says, "Don't hang up on me." He said, "The son of Sam is Dave Berkowitz." And I was just standing there in my kitchen trying to let this register. And I said, "What do you mean it's Dave Berkowitz?" He said, "Eddie, We got the son of Sam, and it's Dave Berkowitz.
Unbelievable.
I'm thinking it can't be our Dave. Dave, like I said earlier, Mark, Dave was a nice guy. Yeah, he might have hit some bumps in the military, but even the brief conversation we had when I ran into him in the Bronx, it seemed like he was trying to get his life back in order and on track. And to hear a buddy of mine telling me that they caught the son of Sam and that it was Dave Berkowitz, this guy who I grew up with and knew well, I was just shocked. He was at my wedding when me and my wife got married. He was at the wedding.
Well, like I said earlier in this prison interview that I referred to, they referred to you as his best friend.
Yeah, well, we were close. I don't know if you would say best. I was one of the closer friends that he had.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, in his mind's eye, you probably were his best friend.
Best friend. I could have been.
All right, Ed. Well, tell us what happened the very next day when you reported for duty.
Well, I'll never forget walking into work the next day and pulling my lieutenant to the side and saying, "Hey, Lieutenant, they got the son of Sam." He said, "Yeah, wasn't that great that they finally got that
So-and-so
guy? Yeah, that third guy.
So-and-so."
And I said, "Yeah." I said, "The problem is I know him." And the lieutenant just looked at me and said, "How well you know him?" I said, "We were very good friends." And he said, "How good?" I said, "We were very good friends." And at that point, I had to sit down and write what they call a 95.
Form 95.
Form 95. Nothing but a blank piece of paper, with lines on it, like most kids use for loose leaf, but it said, Baltimore Police Department, form number 95 on the bottom of it. And it was like I was writing a novel, because I think it was like 15 pages long by the time I got done writing on my relationship with the son of Sam, how I knew the son of Sam, or I should say how I knew Dave Berkowitz. I had to write down everything that I knew about him, if I had contact with him, and when was the last time I talked to him, and, what my dealings with him had been since I was a police officer. And, but of course, too, Mark, at the time, we were getting lookouts from New York, and every major newspaper had the artist sketch of the person that these people had seen running away from the crime scenes in New York, and none of them looked like Dave Berkowitz. I mean, I wouldn't have looked at any of them and said,
"Right,
oh, geez, that's Dave Berkowitz." I don't know how the artists come up with this. It was probably due to inaccurate descriptions by the witnesses.
Right.
But I had no idea, so I had nothing to worry about as far as writing what I did.
And I did a little research, and it seems that there was supposedly an interview with you picked up by the press corps back in '77, and it states, Ed Snediker, who knew Berkowitz when he was growing up, said the boy was bothered by his adopted status. Snediker said Berkowitz, although raised a Jew, was never sure what nationality he really was. Do you recall that interview at all?
Mark, I really don't recall being interviewed. We're talking 40 years ago.
Right.
But, we had talked a little about this before we went on air. And it's not an interview that I recall giving. And actually, I was trying to duck the press at the time because I didn't want to bring any undue attention to me or my family down here in Baltimore. Yeah, I don't recall giving anybody actually a statement. Yeah, maybe I might have been talking to somebody, a friend in New York, and somebody might have said, well, Ed Snediker told me that this was such or whatever, and they might have said something.
Correct.
But I don't recall giving any statements to any media.
Right. So more than likely it's probably second, third hand, and someone said, what's the guy's name? How do you spell it? And
very possibly.
Gotcha.
Very possibly.
Got you. Did you know any of his victims at all?
No, did not. Although, New York being a huge city the way it is, there was a sort of, Mark, as they say, that Kevin Bacon and you're only so many steps away.
Correct.
There was a young lady who was shot, and she was sitting on the porch in the Bronx. And at that time, of course, I didn't know who she was when she was shot, but it turned out that she was friends with my niece's friend or something.
But you don't know anyone that he actually, like, specifically targeted in your neighborhood, correct?
No, but I will share this one with you.
Mm-hmm.
The guy Lenny, who I had mentioned earlier, I'll never forget. I was, I guess, up in New York prior to the time that I saw Dave riding in the cab, and it was when Son of Sam was heading around Brooklyn, and Lenny had a sister named Dorothy, and she had long dark hair, Italian girl, from New York, and I'll never forget him saying to Dorothy, because Dorothy said something that she was going out at night. And Berkowitz looked at her and said, I wouldn't go to Brooklyn tonight. I have an idea the Son of Sam might hit out there. And sure enough, the Son of Sam did hit out there that night in Brooklyn. And Dorothy, of course, had been in the Bronx or Yonkers or whatever.
Right.
And did not go into Brooklyn that night. But, again, being away from New York, it didn't click on me. Actually, I know I was still in the Coast Guard at that time, and wasn't thinking with a law enforcement head that, all of a sudden, here you have a guy saying, "Oh, don't go to the certain area because Son of Sam might hit."
Right.
And but he did give a warning to Dorothy not to go into a certain area.
Tell us about the time when the press had gotten word that someone in your neighborhood was possible friends with Berkowitz and tried to track you down.
Well, at that time in Baltimore, there was some famous news guys, for Baltimore anyway, Jerry Turner and Al Sanders. And I'll never forget turning on the television one night, and they're talking about the Son of Sam and the headlines. Of course, they're reading the scripts from the AP and everything. And they mentioned that Berkowitz had a friend in Baltimore, and they were trying to look for him, and his name was Ed. So that sort of scared me at that time. I'm thinking, oh, geez, the media is going to be looking for me.
And didn't you say that they said you were in the Navy?
Exactly. The one press release, I believe it was in the Baltimore Sun, or the News American might have been at that time too, put in there that they were looking for Ed, and he was in the Navy in Baltimore. Well, obviously, I was in the Coast Guard. I was in the Navy. And also, by that time, I had been discharged. I was already on the police department. But I recall having a news media vehicle going through my neighborhood. It said like WJZ or WFBR, whatever it was, on the side of the truck. And it kept cruising through the streets in Pasadena, Maryland, where I was living at the time. And up and down the streets. And I'm out there. I remember doing something in the yard and looking over and seeing this truck go up and down the street a couple of times. And actually, whoever was driving, I remember them waving to me. I just waved back and continued what I was doing. But I had the suspicion that they were out there looking for me.
But they couldn't find you.
Didn't have an address. So maybe they figured they might talk to somebody who could point them in the right direction.
Any suspicions of who gave them that information? Or
actually, I do have a suspicion. It's somebody who is still around and living in New York. And I have an idea who it might have been.
So, you think his reasoning for the murders was because of Iris, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I still keep in contact with her. She's living in Texas now. And we talked, I guess it was about 2 years ago. There was a parole hearing that was coming up in New York for Son of Sam.
Right.
And she was concerned that he might get paroled and come looking for her. And I told her, as long as there were people alive who remembered the Son of Sam and what he did, he would never get out of that jail.
Right.
And not to be concerned about him coming after her. So she herself feels as if she is probably a person who sort of is responsible for some of the incidents that happened.
Oh, so she actually feels a little guilt out of this?
I would say, I don't know if I call it guilt, but she definitely does feel as if she had something to do with it.
Oh, okay. So I guess that's something that she's been dealing with since the discovery of all this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, Ed, I have to ask you this question. If you could speak to Dave Berkowitz, would you?
I thought about this multiple times over the years. And we're talking, 35 years now since he was convicted and sent away to jail.
Correct.
And I really don't have anything I want to share with them because I moved on in my life. And, here's a guy, in my mind, turned out to be no better than a dog that had rabies. And that's sad to say, although, we were friends at one time, but he became a mad animal. And I wouldn't know what to say to him. It's not the guy who I knew growing up. He was not the guy who I would say was the kind guy who I knew who went out of his way to help people.
It does have to be pretty astonishing that how you get to know someone and you think you know them well and you think they're one type of person. They end up going in an entirely different direction.
But even with his life falling apart, at 20 years old, how bad can it be? You pick up and you regroup and you move on. We all had problems, whether, you were by yourself, living by yourself, or, it seemed as if Dave was maybe on the right road to recovery because he had a job and he had a good job with the federal government. And he was also driving a cab, had his own apartment. But somewhere along the line, things just went different. He didn't do the normal thing, which was, just being a member of society and continuing on in the way he was as a younger man.
Gotcha. Has he made any attempts to contact you after his imprisonment at all?
Nah. I haven't heard from him. Don't wish to hear from him. And, I have no desire to have any communications with him.
So you would have no desires for any interviews with him or any correspondence whatsoever?
Yeah, I have no desire to have any type of contact with Berkowitz. He's not the same guy I knew. I'd rather remember the guy who I knew who was there to help people.
Right.
And who liked people and did the right things. Not the guy who became a mass murderer.
And that's just it. I mean, you knew a side of Dave Berkowitz that most people never saw.
Yeah, most people know what they read in the newspaper or saw on television at the time, or the grinning face of him being handcuffed and doing the perp walk. But they had no idea the guy who was there prior to the murders, and but it was a total different guy. The Berkowitz I saw on television at the trials and doing the perp walk and isn't the guy I knew. The guy I knew was a decent guy.
Now, seeing the footage on television, and because he was all over the news at the time, could you sense there was definitely a big change in his personality?
Well, yeah, obviously, when somebody goes from being a nice guy to being a mass murderer, there's a flip. When it happened, how it happened, that's anybody's guess, I guess. But, yeah, did I actually see it flip? I guess maybe if I was still in New York and had a little more exposure to it, I might have. But, of course, I was just getting what the headlines were down here in, Maryland, as opposed to being in New York and being local.
Well, I want to thank tonight's guest, Mr. Ed Snediker. Ed, thanks for being on the show.
Well, you're very welcome, Mark, and anytime.
All right, that's it for us, folks. For Who's Who Tonight, I'm Mark Bishop. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Who's Who Tonight with Mark Bishop. Visit us on YouTube and on Facebook, or go to our website, who'swhotonight.com.